Oh my God, there's blood everywhere. I think he's dead. There's a woman, she's just standing there. Oh God, she's covered in blood. The 911 operator tried to keep the caller calm, but panic thickened every word. Then static. Silence. Paul Marino's car was the first thing they saw when they arrived. A sleek black Porsche, its glossy surface streaked with something dark. The security lights flickered overhead, casting a dull glow over the broken glass, the deep red stains pooling on the concrete. And then there was the body. 54 years old. A well-known defense attorney. His white shirt soaked in red, his body slumped in the driver's seat. 27 stab wounds. His hands limp at his sides. But it was his eyes that lingered in the minds of those who saw him, wide, frozen in shock. As if, even in death, he couldn't believe what had just happened. A few feet away, she stood. Not running. Not crying. Just staring. Her breath was shallow, her hands slick with blood. The knife had already fallen from her grasp, clattering to the pavement. Officers shouted commands, weapons drawn, but she didn't move. Didn't even blink. And then, in a voice raw and steady, she spoke. You killed our baby. Now I kill you. Her name was Camila Reyes. 28. A paralegal. A woman scorned. She had been many things to Paul Marino, his assistant, his lover, his secret. And on this night, she had become something else entirely. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a random attack. This was personal. The culmination of 27 months of passion, deception, and a promise broken beyond repair. Somewhere on the ground, caught in the chaos, lay a torn ultrasound photo. A tiny life that would never be. Paul Marino had spent his career bending the law in his favor, always one step ahead of the people who sought to bring him down. But in the end, it wasn't a courtroom battle or a clever legal maneuver that sealed his fate. It was something far more primal. Betrayal. Revenge. Love, twisted into something unrecognizable. Camila Reyes didn't fight as they led her away. She didn't need to. She had already said what she came to say. And Paul Marino? His last case had been decided long before the first blade sank into his chest. People like Paul Marino always believe they have control. They build their lives on certainty, every decision carefully weighed, every argument sharpened to perfection. For nearly 3 decades, he had been one of Orlando's most formidable defense attorneys, a man who could twist the law to his favor with a well-timed pause or the right inflection in his voice. In court, he was unstoppable. To his clients, he was their last hope. To his colleagues, he was sharp, cunning, a strategist with an iron will. He fought for those who paid for his expertise, guilty or not. And he won, often. But in the end, no amount of legal brilliance could save him from what was coming. Because power comes with pressure. And pressure reveals weaknesses. Her name was Camila Reyes. She was young, smart, ambitious. A paralegal with a sharp mind and an unwavering focus, the kind of woman who anticipated her boss's needs before he even voiced them. Paul saw it immediately, the way she carried herself, the way she handled high-profile cases with quiet efficiency. She wasn't just another assistant. She was someone who understood him. And for a man like Paul, temptation had always been his greatest weakness. It started the way these things always do. Long hours at the office. Late nights spent reviewing case files. A glance held just a little too long. A hand lingering over a shared document. The moment they crossed the line, Paul convinced himself it was harmless. He was careful, methodical, just like in his cases. He had a wife at home, Linda, the woman who had stood by his side for over 20 years. She wasn't the kind of woman who turned heads in a courtroom. She wasn't polished like Camila. She was steady, kind, the foundation of the life he had built. and she trusted him without hesitation. She had no reason to suspect anything. But secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, have a way of demanding to be known. Camilla learned that firsthand. It was one thing to be the secret, to exist in the stolen moments between cases, hidden behind carefully worded texts and hotel receipts buried in expense reports. But this was different. This had a heartbeat. She had imagined his reaction 100 different ways. The moment she told him, the moment she saw the truth in his eyes. Would he be relieved? Would he finally leave his wife? Would he want this child? But when the words finally left her lips, all she saw was hesitation. The smallest flicker of doubt in a man who had built his entire life on certainty. And that was the moment she knew. She was alone. Days passed. Then weeks. Paul made promises, the kind that dissolved into silence when it mattered most. And Camilla, sharp, meticulous Camilla, had always been good at uncovering the truth. She searched for the signs. Signs he won't leave his wife. What happens when a man lies about leaving his marriage? Can stress cause a miscarriage? The cursor blinked on the screen, waiting. The affair had been a betrayal. But this was something deeper. A fracture that would soon split into something unrecognizable. Something violent. Because promises, once broken, have consequences no one sees coming. And Camila Reyes was about to make sure Paul Marino paid for his. Paul Marino had always been good at making promises. That was his trade, after all, turning words into weapons, shaping them to his advantage, delivering them with just the right amount of conviction. He had built his career on persuasion, bending the law and the truth to suit his needs. But words are easy. It's the breaking of them that carries real weight. Camila Reyes learned that the hard way. At first, it had been intoxicating. The secrecy, the thrill of something forbidden. Late nights in Paul's office, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows as they hovered too close over case files. A brush of fingertips. A look held a second too long. The tension that built and built until it could no longer be ignored. And then it happened. Paul told her she was different. Not just another affair. Not just another passing indulgence. She was the future, the one thing he couldn't stay away from. I think about you all the time. Then why do you go home to her? Because I have to. But not forever. Just give me time. You said that last month. And the month before. She had believed him at first. But time has a way of revealing the truth. The missed dinners. The cancelled plans. The practiced excuses. Something came up at the firm. Linda's suspicious. I need to be careful. Just wait a little longer. But waiting was never the plan. Camila scrolled through Linda's social media, searching for the cracks she wanted to see. But there were none. Only smiling vacation photos, anniversary tributes, the carefully curated facade of a perfect life. 25 years of love, and still going strong. The words sent ice through her veins. Paul was never going to leave his wife. Not for her. Not for anyone. And then, the moment that changed everything. It wasn't just about betrayal. It wasn't just about another lie. It was something deeper, something permanent. The sterile white of the doctor's office. The grainy black and white image on the ultrasound screen. The quiet voice of the technician explaining what Camila already knew. She had imagined this moment before, Paul beside her, his hand in hers, his promise finally taking shape into something real. But he wasn't there. He never would be. The ultrasound photo burned in her palm as she walked out. She stared at it for hours, tracing the outline with her thumb. Then, slowly, methodically, she tore it to pieces. The next day, she told Paul. His response came in a voicemail, short, clipped, his voice controlled, but beneath it, something colder. I don't know what to say, Camila. You should have told me before making that decision. Told him, as if it had ever been a choice. The words burrowed deep, settling into something rotten inside her. He had already made his decision the moment he let her sit in that waiting room alone. Grief twisted into something else. Something darker. Her apartment became a graveyard of everything that could have been. The shredded ultrasound on the floor. The unused pregnancy test in her drawer. The fake pregnancy bump she had once tried on in front of the mirror, wondering how Paul would react when it was real. It sat deflated now, discarded on the bed. A cruel joke. He had promised. He had lied. And now, all Camila Reyes had left was the weight of betrayal. A betrayal that would soon become something neither of them could take back. Some betrayals are quiet. They unfold behind closed doors, whispered in hushed voices, buried beneath layers of secrecy. But others unravel like a slow-moving car crash. Too late to stop, too horrifying to look away. Paul Marino's betrayal was of the latter kind. For 27 months, he and Camila Reyes played a dangerous game. Stolen moments behind office doors. Midnight calls filled with promises. A love that should never have existed, but did. And for Camila, it was real. Real enough to change everything. Real enough to destroy everything. It started small. A shift in Paul's tone. A hesitation before he spoke. The distance that grew between them, subtle at first, then unmistakable. He said it was stress. Work. Linda's growing suspicion. The usual excuses. But Camila knew. She always knew. Then came the phone call. The one that changed everything. We need to slow things down, Camila. She heard it in his voice. The fear, the regret, the way he was already pulling away. Slow things down. Her voice was eerily calm. Or stop. A pause. Too long. It's just, I can't do this to Linda. She's been with me for 25 years. I thought I could leave. But So you lied. Silence. Then, the call disconnected. That was the moment. The moment something inside Camila shifted. She had spent 27 months believing in a future that never existed. She had held on to promises that were never meant to be kept. And now, all of it, the whispered confessions, the hidden smiles, the love she had given so freely, had collapsed into nothing. Betrayal is a wound that festers. And for Camila, it became an obsession. The first signs were there, if anyone had been paying attention. Her co-workers noticed the change. The way she sat at her desk for hours without typing a single word. The way her once-driven nature had turned into something sharper, something unreadable. She was intense, one had said later, voice low, as if speaking of her too loudly might bring something terrible to life. But toward the end, it was different. She'd just stare at her screen. Or leave in the middle of the day. No explanation. She was unraveling. Another had dismissed her at first. Just another woman scorned. Until the questions started. How long do security cameras keep footage? What happens if someone just disappears? At the time, they thought she was bitter. But later, they would wonder, was she planning it even then? And then there were the emails. Sent to Paul at odd hours. The last one, bolded and unread. Subject line, you don't get to decide how this ends. But in the end, it wasn't just the words she left behind. It was the number. The one that had defined everything. 27. 27 months of promises. 27 months of betrayal. The number haunted her, consumed her. And when the rage inside her finally reached its breaking point, she made sure Paul felt every single one of them. The night of September 3rd, he left the office late. He always did. The glass of whiskey on his desk had been half empty when he locked his door. He never saw her waiting. The courthouse parking garage was nearly empty. The flickering of a single overhead light cast long, shifting shadows across the pavement. Paul's Porsche sat in its usual spot, the sleek black car reflecting the dim glow. And in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the light, a figure stood waiting. Paul Marino was about to learn what happens when love turns into something far more dangerous. And the message Camila left behind? It would be unforgettable. The courthouse had long emptied of its daily chaos, the silence settling heavily in the air. As Paul Marino made his way through the dimly lit parking garage, the oppressive humidity clung to him, the air thick as though it were holding its breath. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched like reaching fingers across the cold concrete floor. Paul was already somewhere else, his mind a million miles away from the long day he'd spent in court. His tie hung loose around his neck, the knot undone, and his suit jacket was draped carelessly over his arm. The rhythm of his footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness, a stark contrast to the distant hum of the city outside. He didn't notice the faintest scuff of heels against the pavement, the barely audible breath of someone moving with purpose in the shadows. He was distracted. A drink awaited him at home, the warmth of his wife, Linda, perhaps. Or maybe it was just the thought of sleep, something that had been elusive lately. But if he had been paying attention, if he had been listening, he might have noticed the way the air around him seemed to thicken, or the fact that his car was the only one parked in the garage with one space deliberately left empty next to it. Instead, his eyes were focused on the ground, his hand fumbling for his keys. When the headlights of his Porsche blinked in response to his approach, illuminating the space for just a split second, he caught a glimpse of her in the reflection, a fleeting shadow in the dim light. Camila! His breath caught in his throat, but before he could process the shock, before he could even react, the first strike landed. The blade slipped between his ribs with terrifying precision, a shock of cold steel that stole the air from his lungs in a breathless gasp. His briefcase dropped from his fingers, papers scattering like fallen leaves across the pavement. Pain bloomed across his side, hot and immediate, and his body jerked forward as the realization hit him like a freight train. He turned, eyes wide, searching for the source of the pain. Camila! His voice was barely more than a whisper, a broken plea, but there was no mistaking the look of understanding that flashed in his eyes. He knew. In that instant, he knew what this was. The second strike came swiftly, this time to his shoulder, driving him to his knees. The pain was sharp, but not as sharp as the crushing weight of regret that settled over him. For 27 months, he had held all the power. He had made promises and broken them. He had controlled the narrative, telling her he would leave his wife, promising her they would build a life together, that she was more than just an affair. And yet, here he was, bleeding on the cold concrete floor, his life unraveling with every passing second. Her silence was chilling. She had no words for him, no accusations. She didn't need to say anything. The message was already carved into his flesh. A third, a fourth, a fifth. Each strike deliberate, precise. There was no frenzy in her movements, no desperation in her grip. This was something else, something far colder. She was in control. And with every blow, the balance of power shifted, the weight of his betrayal settling on his chest like a heavy, suffocating stone. By the time the sixth strike landed, Paul was slumped against the door of his car, his blood staining the pristine white of his shirt. His breath came in short, uneven gasps, and the world around him seemed to grow distant, as if he were sinking into the very concrete beneath him. His hands trembled, clutching at his wound in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. She knelt beside him then, her presence a stark contrast to the chaos of his failing body. There was no pity in her eyes, no anger, just the calm, cold resolve of someone who had long since made peace with her actions. "You killed our baby," she said softly, her voice barely more than a breath, as if she were speaking to herself more than to him. She raised the knife one last time, her expression unreadable. "Now, I kill you." The final blow came swift and clean. The 27th strike. No coincidence. No random number. 27 months. 27 broken promises. 27 times he had told her he would leave his wife, that they would have a future, that she was more than just a passing affair. And now, 27 wounds. A perfect symmetry. The call came in at 11:07 p.m. The security guard wasn't sure whether he'd heard a scream or just the unmistakable sound of something wrong, something broken. He didn't hesitate. His hands trembled as he dialed the number for the police, his voice shaking as he described what he had found. By the time the officers arrived, the garage was eerily silent, save for the dripping sound of blood hitting the cold concrete. Paul Marino's body lay sprawled across the pavement, his blood pooling around him, the knife abandoned just out of reach. Camila stood beside him, motionless, her hands slick with his blood. Her eyes were vacant, distant, as though the world around her had ceased to matter. The forensic team arrived soon after, their gloves stained crimson as they began their work. The wounds were deep, precise, each one a deliberate incision, a calculated strike. There was no frenzy, no emotional outburst. This was not a crime of passion, it was an execution. A methodical ending to a story that had been years in the making. Camila did not fight when they cuffed her. She did not cry, nor did she speak. She did not even flinch when they touched her. She simply stared ahead, her gaze fixed on something only she could see. There was no fear in her eyes, no remorse, just the cold, unblinking stare of someone who had already reconciled herself to what had come to pass. The trial was a spectacle. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but Camila sat in silence at the center of it all. She did not cry. She did not plead. The prosecution spoke of broken promises, of betrayal, of a woman pushed to the edge. The defense argued that she had been wronged, that Paul had destroyed her, leaving her with nothing but the crushing weight of loss. The jury deliberated for just over 3 hours, and when the verdict was finally read, Camila barely blinked. The gavel struck the wood, sealing her fate. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. It was a sentence that would be carried out. But it didn't matter to her. Paul was gone. And for Camila Reyes, that had been the only ending that truly mattered. What drives a person to the edge? What turns love into something twisted and irreversible? Some would call Camila a victim. Others, a monster. But in the end, perhaps she was simply inevitable. The first responders arrived to a scene frozen in silence, except for the distant wail of sirens and the murmur of a police scanner crackling to life. The echoes of Camila Reyes' last words had already faded, leaving only the chilling stillness of what remained. Paul Marino lay motionless, his lifeless body slumped beside his car in the dimly lit courthouse parking garage. The blood pooling beneath him stretched outward, a stark contrast against the cold concrete. Just a few feet away, discarded yet deliberate, lay the 6-inch tactical knife, its handle still warm from her grip. There was no mystery in who had done it. Camila had confessed immediately, her voice steady, her eyes empty. The officers who arrested her barely had to ask. But what they would uncover next was even more disturbing. It wasn't just another case of betrayal and revenge. The evidence told a story far more twisted than anyone expected. Detectives combed through Camila's belongings, searching for an answer, a motive that extended beyond the obvious. That was when they found it, a crumpled ultrasound photo, its edges frayed, as if it had been folded and unfolded 100 times. And beside it, something even stranger, a fake pregnancy bump, carefully wrapped and tucked inside her tote bag. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't just a murder. It was a deception layered in tragedy. By the next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Defense attorney murdered in cold blood. Secret mistress confessing. crime of passion or calculated revenge. The truth behind the Paul Marino case. The woman who loved and killed him. News anchors recounted the details with urgent voices. Panels of legal experts debated the psychology behind the crime, and social media ignited with speculation. Some saw Camila as a scorned lover, a woman pushed too far. Others saw her as a manipulative killer, someone who had planned every detail of that night. The case had everything: sex, lies, betrayal, and ultimately, blood. But for one woman, the truth was far more personal. 17 years. That's how long Linda had been married to Paul Marino. She had built a life with him, raised children with him, believed in the illusion of their love. But now, that illusion had shattered. The whispered condolences from friends weren't just about Paul's death. They were about what had come before it. The rumors. The knowing looks from colleagues who had kept their silence. And then, the final betrayal, the locked drawer in Paul's home office. Inside, Linda found it. A second phone, hidden away, filled with months of messages. Promises made to Camila. Plans they had whispered to each other in secret. Lies. Paul had built a world outside of their marriage. And now, that world had collapsed. Linda read through the texts one last time, then set the phone down. She exhaled, slow and steady. And then, as if something inside her had hardened, she made a decision. A month later, Paul's law firm needed a new paralegal. Linda was the one who hired Camila's replacement. Life moved forward. Even in the wake of devastation, psychologists were called in. They examined every detail of Camila's life, searching for the moment where love turned into something unrecognizable. Erotic fixation, one forensic psychologist called it. This wasn't just love, it was an obsession. Camila believed Paul was her future, the one thing she could hold on to. When she realized he had no intention of keeping his promises, when she felt him slipping away, she was left with two choices: accept it or destroy it. The crime scene photos told the rest of the story. The knife. The blood. The 27 wounds, counted and deliberate. Paul Marino never had a chance. The courtroom was packed. Every seat filled. Cameras rolled as Camila Reyes, once invisible in Paul's world, became the center of a spectacle. She sat at the defense table, wrists shackled, her expression unreadable. The prosecution called it premeditated murder. This wasn't a moment of blind rage. This was planned. She waited for him. She made sure he was alone. And she didn't stop until she was certain he wouldn't leave that garage alive. The defense told a different story. She was a woman deceived, manipulated, and discarded. Paul Marino played with her emotions, promised her a future, then abandoned her. She didn't walk into that garage planning to kill him. But in that moment, all of the pain, all of the betrayal, came crashing down. Camila never cried, never defended herself. And when the verdict was read, she barely blinked. Guilty. Life in prison. No parole. Some called it justice. Some called it vengeance. But one truth remained. 3 lives ended that night. One in a pool of blood. One behind prison bars. And one haunted by the ghosts of betrayal. So, we are left with a question. Was Camila Reyes a victim of love, or of her own darkness? Was this a tragic love story turned nightmare? Or was she always destined to become a killer? Somewhere in that courthouse parking garage, between love and rage, the line blurred. And when it did, a man died. Now, the story is yours to unravel. What do you think? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence. Because sometimes, the truth is even darker than we imagine.